Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Narrative Dive, where we are offering you more awareness of the narratives that dominate your world. This is our very first episode of an awesome series that we are media innovating to tell you all about different types of narratives so you can be more aware of everything around you. I am Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
Join us on our quest for truth. Today, we are actually covering meta-narratives, and why we chose this topic for the inaugural episode is meta-narratives are mass overarching narratives that provide historical meaning and tend to dominate the smaller stories we tell ourselves about everything in our everyday lives, from relationships to goals to convictions to our reasons for being. These all come from large, dominant meta-narratives that are embedded in our culture. And these meta-narratives can be different based on where you grew up and what cultural setting you came to be in. And these also have a lot of significance in mythology as well, which Angela will be deep diving into on this episode today. The core of these meta-narratives are generally about some kind of story of legitimization or justification or purpose. They usually answer the question, for what, or for why, or why am I here? That's another one that's quite dominant in, particularly in like pop culture or religion. We get a, why am I here? Why do I exist? And meta-narratives are meant to answer those questions in particular. They are prevalent in religion, and that is one of the biggest meta-narratives we have in the world, are different religions and their approach to stories about life and existence. So they come from Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. What these narratives can do is explain various events in history through a certain lens. They can tell you why something happened. For example, the meta-narrative of creation that we see in Christianity. This is a narrative that explains the existence of all humankind. Why did we come to be? How did we come to be? And what drives our existence and should form our moral, ethical codes and focus.
So to understand meta-narratives, it's really important to first understand what a cosmogony is. A cosmogony is essentially a story about how things came to be. And as Jess mentioned, all religions, but not only religions, all cultures have these kinds of stories. They're sort of the operating system of how we make sense of the world and make sense of ourselves in it. So our particular cosmogony, let's talk about sort of the Western agnostic cosmogony, is a cosmogony about the Big Bang, right? Like we build our larger narrative in this world around rationalism and this idea that, you know, if you look at the Big Bang story, life kind of happened randomly, and that's sort of our basis for rationalism. But interestingly, this basis for rationalism didn't actually come from what we would consider a rational or agnostic place. A big place where this comes from is from Descartes, who in the 1600s kind of defined our model for how we look at the world. And it's sort of funny how we did it. At this time, automata were a really big deal. Little robot toys, they were really big in churches, for example. Kings were ordering them. You know, you could make little automaton saints that could pray for you a certain number of times a day, etc. They were a really big deal. Clockmaking was also coming into its own at this time. So Descartes was thinking about how these machines could look so lifelike and yet were not, and what was the difference between us and machines. And essentially he came up with this idea that the entire world, in fact, is just a machine created by God, and so are animals, and so are anything that looks like it's alive, like plants and trees, but only humans have souls. And here's where you start to see the sort of underpinnings of what we would later build upon to design rationalism, most notably with Darwinism, which I know that you're going to talk about later. But it's kind of funny to think of it as that, this rationalism cosmogony that we have was kind of designed around this idea that came from a godly place in theory, and yeah, this sort of weird conception around robotics.
That's amazing that you mentioned that, because one of the narratives I was going to dive into was in terms of meta narratives, and you mentioned the church, is Christianity. And of course, in Western cultures, the story of Christ is one of the big overarching meta narratives of our time that define so many things, from laws to moral codes to rules of conduct. I mean, this story is embedded in a lot. And this notion of suffering and redemption and being delivered is a notion that speaks to a lot of us, because in this life we suffer. It's part of our code of existing. So when you have a narrative that tells you that the meaning of life comes through the suffering, that the deliverance into a beautiful afterlife or a promise of something better comes from the suffering, then you will continuously appreciate the suffering or justify the suffering for this reason. And this becomes extremely significant. How we were going into Darwinism, and that's an interesting topic for everyone. We will have a separate episode on Darwinism, by the way, that will go very in depth on that. But one thing that we've talked about before, Angela, is how this overarching Christian narrative goes into free market capitalism. And that was one of the examples I was giving on how we have meta narratives, not only at the religious level, but at the social and economic theory level too. Marxism was a meta narrative that spawned so many sub narratives. Freudianism and free market capitalism. Free market capitalism tends to be very attached to the Christian narrative with the Protestant ethic. And I'm sure there's something in mythology that comes back before this Protestant ethic that's behind that.
Let's talk about Christ for a minute. The Christ story is a really impactful story in the story of mythologies, because actually it's a quite unusual story. There are some aspects of it that are not very unusual. A resurrection savior story is not especially unusual. Dionysus did that. Osiris does that. Notably in Wicca and Celtic mythology, there's this sort of ongoing story of the year where, the goddess meets her lover, and then they get together and everything flowers, and then he dies, and then she gives birth to him again. She gives birth to him again and again and again over the course of the year. So this is quite an old story. But the Christ mythology is so powerful because it also builds on this much older idea that comes from, the sort of like deep Abrahamic religion, that there is something fundamentally wrong with us, right? Like the Garden of Eden story is a very strong meta narrative in our culture. Even if we don't consider ourselves religious, there's this overarching idea that humans are fundamentally selfish, transactional. You can't really trust us. And that's why we need all of these laws to make sure that people don't do bad things. And the fact that Christ kind of takes this burden from us and dies for our sins is a really meaningful idea. He gives us a shot at heaven. So now we have this shot. But from the perspective of this mythology, we're still fundamentally bad, which is where the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism comes in, where basically what the Protestant ethic argues is that you kind of, like God is rewarding good behavior and hard work with profit and with abundance. So the logic of that is, if you have a lot and if you can support your family and if you have enough to share, that kind of means that you deserve it. And if you don't, maybe there's a reason why you don't. Maybe you're not living a sufficiently godly life, which is interestingly one of the reasons why Americans, for example, have trouble complaining, or why it's very hard for us to justify the logic of having a socialized healthcare system, because one of the interesting offshoots of this is that Christianity is very zero-sum. You have good on one side and evil on the other side. So if you're operating on the opposite end of capitalism, if you're operating on the opposite end of the market, then by nature, there's something wrong with this. There's something really bad and problematic about this. So just to return to your question, David Graeber, who wrote The Dawn of Everything, made the case that basically what he does is he looks at different ways that people have lived before. And in fact, there are many different kinds of ways that people have lived before that we've just kind of canceled out because they don't really match the narrative that we are at the highest point of civilization and technology in the human story so far, which is something else that we can talk about later. But essentially what he says is that in a lot of older societies, the choice of a chieftain or a leader was not made based on, how much influence or power or belongings you had. It was based on how much you could actually offer in return to the community, how much you had to share. Obviously, in cases of drought and difficulty, these situations were different. And suddenly the leader would take on a much more rigid role where, you just kind of fell in line and did whatever you had to, did whatever the leader obliged you to, just so that everybody could get through that period. But once that period was over, everyone relaxed again. And even in societies where there was a lot of competition to acquire and to have nice things, there was also an equal amount of competition to kind of share it and spread it, or even burn it, to kind of get rid of it.
Yeah. Or people. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was the other one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the case that David Graeber makes is that to have a model like capitalism that looks like the one we have today, it's actually really different from how people have lived before. It's quite a disruptive in that sense. It's not something that looks like it makes a ton of sense. Like, why would you acquire more than you need while somebody next to you starves? So you needed to have a really rigid kind of belief system behind you in order to behave in this way that in early times might have looked unusual to other people around you and other communities. So the case that he makes is that for a system like capitalism, you really do need a God, like the Abrahamic God, to kind of sit under it and design that logic in the first place. Like, even if we kind of think that we've done away with it now, a lot of the vestiges of that remain with us, hence the Protestant ethic.
That's very true. Yeah. And the Protestant ethic centers around this notion that, and you still see this in, I think, not as much in Europe from my observation of having lived here for years and you having lived here for years, but in cities like New York in the US, you see this at play where there's this justification of working hard, working long hours, and believing that by doing so, you're somehow redeemed, that you'll get ahead, that you'll get more by giving more and by sacrificing. And it's, in some ways, it's a sub-narrative of sacrifice for redemption, which comes from that meta-narrative, again, of the Christ story, essentially. And just as a disclaimer, we are not refuting whether anything is right or wrong. We are merely observers here. So the point of us having these conversations is to be thought-provoking, but not to tell any specific group of people whether or not their beliefs are good or bad or right or wrong. So
yeah, that does merit mentioning. These are stories, so it's helpful to look at them from a certain distance, but it's also helpful to understand. I think in our culture, we kind of treat stories like vessels for whatever we want to put inside them. Like in media, stories are designed for entertainment or having people swallow a little bit of news, or in advertising, stories are designed to sell things to people. But stories are also a really ancient technology. It's one of the biggest technologies that we use to design meaning and also to design collective reality.
That's very true. I love that you said that. I think that's going to be our takeaway quote on this episode. Stories are ancient technologies. They absolutely are. They were the first way of communicating, of creating relational bonds in ancient communities. And archaeology has found many records of this throughout history. And going back again to this Protestant ethic, I had touched on Darwinism earlier, and something I was working on a piece recently where I came to an interesting conclusion that Darwinism was adopted by capitalists for its redemptive capacity. And what I mean by that is Darwinism looks at a survival of a group of people who are the fittest to perform labor, to excel, to push the human race forward. And so in many ways, and there's been several writings and essays arguing this. I can put a few below if anyone's interested. But the argument has become that Darwinism became a dogma within capitalism. So what you actually have surrounding capitalism, if everyone can visualize this, is that you have this large circle that is the meta-narrative of Christ and redemption. You have a smaller circle within that larger circle that is capitalism, or free market capitalism more so specifically. And then within that circle, you now have this notion of Darwinism as a dogma, or the story of Darwinism, which connects back to this much bigger narrative.
Yeah, and you also, Darwinism also attaches science to this, right? Which kind of becomes what would be the official Western cultural religion about, how things came to be and where we're from and how things work. But the interesting thing about Darwinism, I'm thinking about Eric Yance's The Self-Organizing Universe, is that I think that what we tend to take away from it is this survival of the fittest adaptation idea. And you can see lots of negative ways in which this has been kind of used. Like it became a really solid basis for eugenics, for example. And it remains quite a solid basis for the logic of capitalism. It's like the laws of the jungle. And, like I think hedge fund managers will say things like that quite often. But the argument that Eric Yance makes is that we completely misunderstood what Darwinism was seeking to convey, or at the very least, we just took what we wanted out of it, which is something that, people just do that. That's fine. But essentially, Darwinism, as we understand it, kind of assumes that everything is evolving based on environmental conditions, and then you kind of get rid of the things that are weaker and you get stronger, and that's how species survive and move on. But the argument that Eric Yance makes is that this is kind of faulty from the beginning, because it makes the assumption that we're kind of evolving on this linear track and nothing else is actually evolving around us. Like the environment functionally remains the same, but it is also evolving in response to us. Like that's what's happening with climate change, right? So everything is kind of in constant interaction with us, whether we know it or not. And based on how we adapt and change and evolve, everything else around us is also adapting and changing and evolving, which makes existence look a lot more like a collaboration, like a shared creativity project, than a competitive situation. Because when you're looking at it as more of a shared creativity project, it's more like a conversation or even a conflict. And it's not actually sure whether the strongest or the fittest survive. It's not even actually clear what that means in that context, because what do they survive against if everything, including the environment, is also always evolving? And again, this brings us back to Descartes, who makes the case that our environments and everything else around us is kind of an inert plaything that's a machine made by God, and we can kind of do whatever we want with them because we're the things that are most important in the story.
And the interesting thing about Descartes is that narrative fits into the Christian meta-narrative.
Yes,
is
exactly.
that you've got this like really interesting take on this. And then when if you were to picture this as circles on a canvas, you would see that, oh my goodness, this narrative fits actually into the Christian meta-narrative.
Yeah, they all interlock.
Exactly. So if that's one takeaway I'd want anybody listening to this episode and our conversations to have is you are running programming that is thousands of years old in many cases. And a lot of the decisions that are dictated to you are coming from notions of thought and stories that belong to very ancient ancestors. And of course, I could go all spiritual about that and and totally take this down a different track. But I think it's just an important takeaway that maybe the reason you're staying in the relationship you're staying in is because of some kind of Judeo-Christian notion of guilt or a Judeo-Christian notion of doing the right thing. And so you think and believe that by remaining in a bad situation, that you are doing the right thing. So what I want to point out on a practical everyday level is that narrative that is thousands of years old is the driving force for you staying where you are and not changing your life. So think about this, really think about this. And one prompt I would give anybody listening is go to your journal or a piece of paper or a calendar on your desk or whatever it is, and write down one meta narrative that you think is driving you, that you maybe weren't consciously aware of before.
Good luck with that project.
And please, this series is not intended to diagnose or treat any sort of issues you think you may be having. Contact your doctor as a disclaimer. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
or like, have a little think before quitting your job, but definitely examine your relationship to your job, because there are also social mobility meta narratives that are starting to collapse. It's an interesting time.
Don't walk into your job and say, I quit because of a meta narrative.
Yeah, this is all fake.
What? What are you talking about?
I mean, I guess you could. I've become really relativist about these things. But yeah, there's also social relationships to take into account. So
yes, there are definitely. And actually some of those social relationships you might have maybe because of a meta narrative, like I said. So it's really amazing how this type of programming is so ingrained in us. And one of the things I also wanted to emphasize in this episode is these narratives are a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. And one of the easiest ways to exploit a population, which we saw in the Facebook dilemma from a couple of years back in the 2016 US election, and in the Russian hacking on of Ukraine society, essentially, is that there were several meta narratives that were exploited with using these tools that Facebook had provided to put messages out that stimulated these meta narratives and angered a lot of people, and therefore caused uproars and violence and everything. So it's important to realize that it's there, it's there in the sky, it's right above you. And it is, I don't know if anyone has seen Bird Box, but I would equate some of these more sinister meta narratives with this stalking entity that you maybe are not conscious of is there, but it's there.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because one thing that I wish we took into consideration a lot more, particularly in the world of advertising, where, we all just compulsively tell stories, but in advertising, a lot of stories are used in the service of things that are perhaps not that great. In older pre-colonial cultures, a lot of them anyway, stories were mostly the function of shamans, designated storytellers, and also older people. Older people were always considered of great value in the culture. And one of the reasons for this is that stories, just like plants, were considered a live medicine. You had to take them really seriously because they could heal an individual or a community, but on the other side of that, they could also harm them. So you really had to think about the kind of story that you were looking to convey. And because they do impact us. Like, just look at the impact of Star Wars on how people feel and how people perceive the world, for example.
And this is definitely built off of a quest meta narrative of
suffering
and the hero's journey, which we are going to cover in an episode. But this notion of suffering and redemption, and getting the prize for your efforts of suffering, and having to move through each level of your suffering to achieve this great goal in the end, or rebalance the universe as it was in the Star Wars saga.
So I think that, to kind of sum things up, I would just say that as a TLDR, meta narratives are the stories, the larger arc stories that sit on top of the stories about what's happening in your life and in the world. And it's good to be aware of them, and to also be aware of the fact that there are other stories out there. There have been other stories of how we live and how we think of reality. And there's something, at least in my personal opinion, I find that there's something really freeing about that.
Definitely. And how I would compare meta narratives to anybody who's used a modern slide deck It's if you've used a PowerPoint deck or Google Slides or any kind of slide deck, you always have what's called a master slide. And that slide dictates any of the design decision-making on the deck and how everything will appear and look, and the colors and the branding and whatever is on the deck, the fonts, pictures will all come from the master slide, or even master deck in some cases for frequently reused decks. But think of the meta narrative as that master slide, and the rest of the other slides following it as these more minor narratives that come from that master. I think by us framing this in your mind that way, it should hopefully give you a new perspective on the influences around you, which is our goal, of course.
Okay, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening. And if you like it, subscribe, tell your friends. It always helps. And be sure to tune in next time when we look at the hero's journey narratives in mythology, pop culture, literature, politics, tech, communities. It's basically everywhere. We'll explain what it is, what's seductive about it, why it's so popular, and where it comes from. So looking forward to seeing you again.
Join us on the hero's journey. And another reminder, we are media innovating with this series. We are here to show our work, as they say. I'm a journalist. She's a mythologist. She's also my editor at a publication as well. So part of the joy of the process for us is showing you our process and getting your feedback and hopefully creating something really powerful with the community that we're hoping to build, that are also equally as enthusiastic about understanding narratives as we are. Narratives are more powerful than any of you can think, and we hope that this series will wake you up to their power and influence in your life. Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care.